I don't usually shop at the big box store near my house. It's always too crowded, the aisles cluttered, and the fluorescent lights give me a headache. But last Saturday I needed a new phone charger, and it was the only place open late. It was almost... The store was quiet, the massive sliding doors opening with a groan as I stepped inside. Most of the aisles were empty, save for a few last-minute shoppers and employees straightening shelves. I grabbed a cart, even though I didn't need one. It made me feel less awkward wandering around. The electronics section was at the back of the store, past rows of clothing, kitchen appliances, and random seasonal decorations. As I turned the corner into the aisle lined with chargers and cables, I saw her. She was standing at the far end of the aisle, facing the shelves. At first, I thought she was another customer, but something about her posture caught my attention. She was too still, her arms hanging limply at her sides. Her hair was long and stringy, like it hadn't been washed in weeks, and her clothes looked wrong. Too thin for the chilly weather outside. I kept my distance, reaching for a charger without taking my eyes off her. She didn't move, didn't even seem to notice me. I told myself she was probably just tired or deep in thought, but as I turned to leave the aisle, she spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but the words were clear. She said, "Do you know where he is?" I froze, my hand tightening around the cart handle. I wasn't sure if she was talking to me or just mumbling to herself, but something about her tone sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced over my shoulder and said, "Sorry, what?" She didn't respond. She hadn't turned around either. She just stood there, staring at the shelf. I felt a creeping unease, like I shouldn't be there, but I couldn't seem to make myself move. Then she spoke again. This time her voice was louder, sharper. She said, "He shouldn't be here." I took a step back, my heart pounding. I said, "Who are you talking about?" She didn't answer. Slowly, her head tilted to one side, the motion unnaturally slow, like a puppet on strings. That's when I noticed the reflection. The shelves were made of polished metal, and I could see her face in the faint, distorted glare. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, but it wasn't just that. Her mouth wasn't moving when she spoke. It was frozen in a half smile, the corners of her lips stretched too far. She said, "You should leave." I didn't need to be told twice. I abandoned the cart and hurried out of the aisle, my pulse racing. As I made my way toward the front of the store, I noticed something strange. The other shoppers were gone. So were the employees. The entire store was silent, except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. I picked up my pace, my footsteps echoing in the empty aisles. When I reached the registers, they were all unmanned. Even the self-checkout kiosks were dark, their screens blank. Panic set in as I realized I couldn't see the sliding doors anymore, just the endless rows of aisles stretching into the distance. I turned back, hoping to find another way out, but the aisles were different now. They seemed longer, narrower, the shelves towering over me like walls. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and the lights flickered overhead. Then I heard it. The sound was faint at first, like footsteps shuffling across the tile. It came from somewhere behind me, slow and deliberate. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. When I turned around, she was there. She was standing at the end of the aisle, her head tilted at that unnatural angle, her unblinking eyes fixed on me. Her smile was wider now, almost splitting her face in half. She didn't move, but I could hear the shuffling footsteps getting louder, closer. I ran. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away from her. The aisles blurred together as I sprinted through the store, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The footsteps followed, echoing in my ears, always just out of sight. Finally, I saw it, the faint glow of the exit sign. I bolted toward it, my legs burning, and slammed into the doors with all my strength. They opened with a loud hiss, and I stumbled into the cold night air. The parking lot was empty, my car the only vehicle in sight. I didn't stop running until I was behind the wheel, the engine roaring to life as I sped away. I didn't look back. When I got home, I locked the doors and windows, my hands trembling as I replayed what had happened. I tried to convince myself it was a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion. But when I reached into my pocket, I found something that wasn't mine. It was a small, crumpled receipt. The ink was faded, but I could just make out the words printed on it. Thank you for visiting. Come back soon. The laundromat near my apartment is nothing special. Faded yellow walls, flickering fluorescent lights, and a couple of vending machines stocked with stale snacks. It's the kind of place you go to when you don't have any better options. I've been using it for years, and until last week I never thought much about it. It was late, probably close to midnight, and the place was nearly empty. I like going at that hour because it's quiet, no one fighting over the machines or blasting music on their phones. There was just one other person there, an older man sitting by the dryers reading a magazine. He didn't look up when I walked in. I loaded my clothes into a washer and settled into one of the plastic chairs by the wall, scrolling through my phone while the machine hummed in the background. After a few minutes, I realized the older man was gone. His magazine was still on the chair, but there was no sign of him. I figured he must have stepped outside for a smoke or something. That's when the light started flickering. At first, I ignored it. Like I said, the place is old, and the wiring isn't great. But then I noticed something strange. The flickering wasn't random. It was rhythmic, almost like it was trying to spell something out. I don't know why that thought crossed my mind, but once it did, I couldn't shake it. I tried to focus on my phone, but the flickering grew more intense. The hum of the washers and dryers seemed louder, more distorted, like it was coming from inside my head. I glanced around, hoping to see the older man coming back, but the laundromat was empty. Then I heard it. A soft tapping sound, like knuckles rapping against glass. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent. My stomach tightened as I realized it was coming from the row of dryers across the room. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I told myself it was nothing, just the machine acting up, but my feet carried me closer anyway. When I reached the dryers, I froze. The tapping had stopped, but something was wrong. One of the dryer doors was slightly ajar. The round glass window fogged over, as if something warm had been inside. My reflection stared back at me, pale and nervous. Then the door swung open. I jumped back, my heart racing. The dryer was empty, its drum completely still. I glanced around, expecting to see someone messing with me, but the room was still deserted. The only sound was the low hum of the machines. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I was just tired. I closed the dryer door and turned back toward my chair, but I didn't make it 2 steps before I stopped in my tracks. The washers had stopped running. All of them. The silence was deafening. My clothes were still sitting in the drum, soaking wet, even though the timer said there were 15 minutes left. I pressed a few buttons trying to restart it, but nothing happened. The machines were dead. A cold draft brushed past me, and I turned toward the entrance. The door was wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. I hadn't heard it open, and I was sure I'd closed it when I came in. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door. My unfinished laundry be damned. As I stepped outside, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the glass door. It was faint, barely visible, but it was there. A figure standing in the corner of the laundromat, shrouded in shadow. I spun around, but the room was empty. The figure was gone. I didn't go back inside. I walked home, my bag slung over my shoulder, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The streets were eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched. When I got home, I locked the door and sat on the couch, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But when I reached into my bag to grab my phone, I found something that made my blood run cold. Sitting on top of my clothes was a single, folded slip of paper. I hadn't put it there. My hands shook as I unfolded it, revealing 4 words scrawled in jagged handwriting. Don't come back alone. There was some. I used to love visiting the mall late in the evening. It was always quieter then, with most of the crowds gone and the stores winding down for the night. There was something calming about wandering through the empty corridors, the soft music playing over the speakers. But after last week, I don't think I'll ever go back. It was a Tuesday just before closing. I had gone to pick up a pair of shoes I'd ordered online and decided to kill some time browsing. The mall was nearly empty, just a handful of shoppers scattered throughout. Most of the stores were already closing up, their metal gates halfway down. As I wandered past the food court, I saw her, a little girl no older than 8, standing in front of the carousel. She was wearing a pale pink dress, her hair tied up in 2 neat braids. She wasn't with anyone, just standing there, staring at the carousel as it spun slowly, even though it was shut down for the night. I hesitated. Something about her seemed off. She didn't look lost or upset, just completely still, like she was waiting for something. I approached cautiously and said, "Hey, are you okay?" She didn't respond. I glanced around, expecting to see a parent or someone nearby, but the area was empty. I asked her again if she was okay, but she just kept staring at the carousel. Her expression was blank, her eyes fixed on one of the horses as it moved up and down in slow, mechanical motions. A security guard walked by, and I flagged him down. I told him about the girl and asked if he could help her find her parents. He nodded and walked over to her, crouching down to her level. I stayed back, watching. He said something to her, but she didn't respond. He tried again, this time reaching out to touch her shoulder. That's when she turned to look at him. Her face was wrong. It wasn't her features. They were normal enough. It was the expression. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, her mouth slightly open like she was about to scream but never did. The guard froze, his hand hovering in the air like he couldn't bring himself to touch her. Then she smiled. It wasn't a child's smile. It was too big, too forced, like she was mimicking something she didn't quite understand. The guard stood up abruptly and took a step back, muttering something under his breath. He turned to me and said, "She's fine, don't worry about it." His voice was tight, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. I watched as he walked away, glancing over his shoulder once before disappearing around the corner. The girl stayed where she was, her smile fading as she turned back to the carousel. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to leave, to pretend I hadn't seen her, but another part felt like I couldn't just walk away. I took a step closer and asked, "Do you need help?" Her head snapped toward me so quickly it made me flinch. She stared at me for a long moment before saying, "You shouldn't be here." Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but the words sent a chill down my spine. Before I could respond, the lights in the food court flickered and went out, plunging the area into darkness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. When the lights came back on, the girl was gone. I looked around frantically, but there was no sign of her. The carousel was still, the horses frozen mid-motion. I ran to the nearest store and told the employees what had happened, but they just gave me strange looks. One of them said, "There's no carousel here. There hasn't been one in years." I didn't believe her. I knew what I had seen. I left the mall as quickly as I could, my skin crawling with the sense that I was being watched. When I got to my car, I checked the back seat before getting in, something I'd never done before. The entire drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I got back to my apartment, I went straight to my room and locked the door. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying the girl's words in my head, over and over. "You shouldn't be here." The next morning, I checked the mall's website, looking for any mention of the carousel. There was nothing. I even searched old photos of the food court, but found no sign it had ever been there. But the thing is, I wasn't imagining it. I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of carnival music drifting in through my bedroom window. There was something. I always shop late at night. The grocery store down the street is open 24 hours, and there's something peaceful about wandering the aisles when no one else is around. It's quiet, just the hum of the refrigerators and the occasional squeak of my cartwheels. But last night that peace was shattered. I'd finished most of my shopping, milk, bread, a few frozen dinners, and was heading toward the snack aisle when I noticed something odd. The overhead lights flickered once, then twice, before settling into a dull hum. I didn't think much of it at first. The store was old, and the wiring probably needed work. But as I turned the corner into the snack aisle, I realized I wasn't alone. There was a man standing at the far end of the aisle, his back to me. He wasn't holding a cart or a basket, just standing there, staring at the shelves. His posture was stiff, his arms hanging awkwardly at his sides. I called out, "Excuse me." He didn't move. I felt a strange prickle of unease, but I shook it off. Maybe he was lost in thought or trying to decide between chips and pretzels. I grabbed a bag of popcorn and turned my cart around, heading toward the checkout. The cashier was a young guy, probably in his early 20s, with earbuds tucked under his hoodie. He barely looked up as he scanned my items, muttering, "Have a good night," as I paid. I loaded my bags into the cart and started toward the exit, but as I passed the last aisle, I saw the man again. This time he was closer, standing at the edge of the frozen food section. His back was still to me, but his posture had changed. His head was tilted slightly, as if he were listening to something I couldn't hear. My heart began to race. There was something deeply wrong about him, something I couldn't quite put into words. I hurried out of the store, my cart rattling loudly against the pavement. The parking lot was almost empty, just a few scattered cars under the dim glow of the streetlights. I loaded my bags into the trunk and glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing behind me. But the lot was empty. I got into the car and locked the doors, gripping the steering wheel tightly. My breath was shallow, my pulse pounding in my ears. I told myself I was being paranoid, that he was probably just some weirdo who happened to shop at the same time as me. But as I pulled out of the lot, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. He was standing by the automatic doors, his face finally visible. It wasn't right. His features were sharp and angular, too symmetrical, like a mannequin come to life. His eyes were dark, empty, and fixed directly on me. I drove home as fast as I could, my hands trembling on the wheel. When I pulled into my driveway, I didn't bother unloading the groceries. I just grabbed my keys and ran inside, locking the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night jumping at every little sound, my eyes darting to the windows. I didn't see him again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching. This morning I finally worked up the courage to unload my car. As I opened the trunk, my stomach dropped. Sitting on top of my grocery bags was something that hadn't been there before. A single, unopened bag of chips, the same kind he'd been staring at in the aisle. There was something. I've worked at the downtown coffee shop for nearly 3 years. It's not a bad gig. Decent tips, flexible hours, and a steady stream of regulars who make the long shifts bearable. Most days blend together, but every now and then something strange happens. And last Thursday? That was the strangest day of them all. The morning rush had just died down, and I was wiping down the counters while my coworker Jen restocked the pastry case. The shop was mostly empty, save for a man in the corner booth typing furiously on his laptop and an older woman sipping tea by the window. That's when he walked in. He was average looking, mid-30s, clean-shaven, wearing a gray hoodie and jeans. But something about him immediately set me on edge. His movements were jerky, like he wasn't quite used to his own body. He stood by the door for a moment, scanning the room in a way that felt off. When his eyes landed on me, I felt a chill run down my spine. I forced a smile and said, "Can I help you?" He didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked to the counter, his footsteps unnervingly slow and deliberate. He leaned in close, too close, and said, "Coffee. Black." His voice was flat, almost robotic. I rang him up, trying to shake the creeping unease. As I handed him his change, his fingers brushed mine, and they were ice cold. Not just cold like he'd been outside, cold like something that had never been warm. He took his coffee and sat at the table closest to the counter, directly across from the register. I tried to ignore him, but I could feel his eyes on me every time I moved. It wasn't just staring. It was studying like he was memorizing every detail. Jen noticed too. She said, "That guy's giving me the creeps." I nodded and told her I'd handle it if he caused any trouble. But he didn't do anything. He just sat there, sipping his coffee in slow, deliberate gulps, never breaking eye contact. About 15 minutes later, the man with the laptop packed up and left, followed shortly by the older woman. That left just the three of us, me, Jen, and the stranger. The shop felt unnaturally quiet, the hum of the espresso machine the only sound. Then he spoke again. He said, "You shouldn't be here." I froze. Jen heard it too. She said, "Excuse me?" He didn't answer her. He just kept staring at me. I asked him what he meant, trying to keep my voice steady. He tilted his head slightly like a bird examining something unfamiliar. Then he said, "It's not safe. You should leave." His tone was calm, almost polite, but the words sent a jolt of fear through me. I told him he needed to go if he was going to talk like that. He didn't move. Instead, he reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. He slid it across the counter toward me without saying a word. I glanced at Jen, who gave me a small nod as if to say, "Open it." My hands were shaking as I unfolded the paper. It was blank, except for a single sentence written in shaky, uneven letters. "Do not trust them." I looked up to ask what it meant, but he was gone. No sound of the door opening, no footsteps, nothing, just gone. Jen and I stared at each other, unsure of what to do. She said, "Should we call someone?" I wasn't sure what she meant. The police? An ambulance? I told her to let it go, that he was probably just some weirdo trying to mess with us. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When my shift ended, I decided to take the long way home, sticking to well-lit streets and avoiding alleyways. That's when I saw him again. He was standing on the opposite side of the street under a flickering street lamp. His face was obscured by shadow, but I knew it was him. He wasn't moving, just standing there watching me. I picked up my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned a corner, and when I looked back, he was gone. But I wasn't alone. The street was empty, but the air felt wrong, heavy, like a storm was about to break. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift, moving in ways they shouldn't. And then I heard it, a low guttural whisper, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I started to run. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were all I could hear. My vision blurred, my legs aching as I pushed myself harder. When I finally reached my apartment, I slammed the door behind me and locked it. The whisper stopped. The air was still again, the only sound my ragged breathing. I tried to convince myself it was over, that I was safe. But when I went to toss my bag on the couch, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Sitting on the coffee table was a crumpled piece of paper, the same paper he had given me earlier. This time, there was a new message written beneath the first. "You didn't listen.